So the graphic we're going to be making today is this feature of DeAndre Hopkins, Player of the Week, which is very similar to something the NFL posted last week after he made a pretty amazing catch. So I'm going to start from a blank canvas here and show you all the steps on how to make this. The first thing we're going to do is the background color. So in the assets I've given you guys, I attached this Arizona Cardinals red, which is going to be important because like most sports teams, they have official colors and you can only use those branded colors. The next important step is going to be to lock this, just so that if you're clicking on other layers, it won't affect the red and you won't accidentally drag the red. Our next step that's part of pretty much every graphic I've ever made for Clemson and almost anything I've ever seen online is the cutout. So I've included a cutout photo over here that I'm just going to drag onto the canvas and center it here. And the most efficient and quickest way I found to do cutouts is to use this quick selection tool here. This really lets Photoshop do most of the work for you. So I'm going to click the quick selection tool and then go to select subject. Once I have done this, you can see Photoshop pretty much chose what it thinks is the subject of this photo. But what I'm going to have to do is just fine-tune the edges here. So up here you can see I'm on the little minus with the brush, so this is going to subtract what I click from the selection. So I don't want this player at all, so I'm going to take this, drag it over him so he's not selected at all, no little dashed lines. I'm then going to do the same thing over here, just around the edges of DeAndre. And if you want to add something back, you can either go to the plus, or what I find is a little easier, hold down shift, and it'll just change it to a plus for a minute while you do that. So as you can see, it's a little sensitive, but you really just want to select what you want and add in a bit of his hair here, and you should pretty much be able to let Photoshop do all of this work for you. So once I have what I am pretty confident it is selected as all of him, I'm going to go up here to select and mask. It should outline it and make the rest of it pretty transparent. And one thing I like to do is bump up the contrast a little just to make the edges a little cleaner. As you can see, some of them are kind of fuzzy right now. So once I have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to do with that, I'll hit OK, and it'll have him outlined how I did it with the brush tool. So the next step to the cutout that is super important and that's going to come up a lot throughout the rest of the workshop is putting it into a layer mask. So if you worked in Photoshop a lot, you've probably worked with layer masks, but all you have to do is make sure you're still on the quick selection tool and he's selected, and click the layer mask button down here. So this will outline him and make sure you can just see him with the background. So I'm gonna make him a little bigger and center him about where I have him on the final product. And then I'm going to zoom in and show you how to erase some of these little details that accidentally got selected with the quick selection tool. So when you have the layer mask selected, you can go over here to the brush tool, and you want to make sure it's smaller, and you want to make sure it's a hard brush tool up here in this menu. You also want to make sure your opacity is at 100%, so it's erasing all of what you're clicking on. And then the last thing that you have to check on is that the colors here are black and white. If your color is black in the front and you're going over something, it's erasing it. And if it's white in the front, it'll add stuff back. So I'm just going to go over and fix up the edges just a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just to make sure that when I add any shadows or other effects, I only have him cut out, and that's all that it applies to. So sometimes the harder parts are things like the hair here, where you have to do a little bit more detail. But since we're working in the layer mask, you can always go back and work on this afterwards and just make sure you got all the details. So I'm gonna say that looks pretty good for the cutout for now. Again, you can go back and fix the edges or fine tune things however you like. I'm actually gonna fix one more thing here. But the next step is you might notice he has some like green reflections on him from the grass that the final product does not have on it. So to fix that, you make sure the photo is selected and you can, my zoom bar is in front of this, but you need to go to filter. um, I can't click on filter. Oh, never mind. Sorry, I got it. You go to filter at the top of your screen and you can go to camera raw filter. So once you have the photo in here, you can basically have like, if any of you have ever used Lightroom before, you have all the effects that you have in Lightroom. So I'm just gonna make him a little darker. And one thing that we always do with Clemson graphics is increase the dehaze just to make it a little bit clearer. The next thing you want to check is the color mixer. So this is where you can adjust it to really like match the color of the background and everything. So if you can see, he's a little bit more red than the background color right now. If I drag that down, you can see both. So I'm going to change the hue of the red just a little bit to match the color of the background more. And the next thing I'm going to do is check on the saturation of the different colors. So to get rid of the green stains on his leggings, I can just decrease the saturation of the green. And then you can see there's still a little bit of color on his arms and a little bit on his knee over here. So I can also take the yellow down a little bit just to make sure that's gone. And then the last thing that you can change here is the luminance. So the one thing I'm going to change is the red, and I'm going to decrease it just a little bit. So once I think he looks good, I'll hit OK, and it will change him on the main screen. So now you can see he looks a little more complete like the one over here. So the next step to really anchor him into the graphic and make sure it's all tied together is to add in shadows. And sorry, my zoom's being strange. All right. To add in shadows, you're going to go create a new layer. So what I do to do this is you can either right click and, or not right click, sorry. I go Command Shift and then hit N. So that'll create a new layer, and you want to put it between the background and him. So it's behind him, but ahead of the red color. And then I'd go over here to the gradient tool. And up here, make sure it's selected on the little circle, the radial one. And then for here, you can go into the colors. And you want it to be black from both one end to the next so that it doesn't fade from black into another color. And on the top, you want the opacity to be 100% on one end and 0% on the other. So once I have that selected, I can zoom in, and I'm going to hold down Shift as I do this, but I'm just going to click and drag down. So it'll make like a perfect little circle of shadow. So once I have this, I want to drag it down to his foot, and then I'm going to hold down Command and drag the top thing to the bottom just to flatten the shadow. So from that, I can resize it using the corners, and I can turn it a little bit and adjust it so that it fits underneath his foot. This way, it'll really like anchor him to the page and make him look more realistic.
I have a super quick question. Do you know, I can never remember the PC equivalent to the command button. Do you?
I think it's Control.
Okay.
Sorry, I do have a Mac, so I'm pretty sure it's Control on the PC.
Okay, that sounds right. All right, thank you.
Okay. All right, so now that I have this shadow down here, I'm going to do a similar thing to what I did with the cutout with the layer mask, just so I can adjust it. And I'm going to go to the brush tool again. And this time, instead of making it a hard brush, I'll make it a round one so that it's faded on the edges. And I'm also going to decrease the opacity to around 60%. And once I do this, I can really just like fine tune the edges of the shadow to make it like smaller and blend into the background better. So it's not a huge shadow around his foot and looks more realistic. The next step for the shadows is going to be making his actual shadow on the ground, which you can see over here. So to do this, I select his cutout and I can just go to Effects and make a drop shadow. When I'm making a drop shadow, I typically like to make sure the distance, spread, and size are all 3 apart and that none of them go above 15. That's just become a rule that I've learned throughout my experience with Clemson and making these sports graphics. And then for the opacity of this one, I'll make it just above 50% so that I'll be able to see it when it goes onto the ground. So once I've created his drop shadow, I'm going to right click on drop shadow and go down to create layer, which is going to separate it from his cutout. So now you can see it's its own layer over here. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the little foot shadow and hold down Command while I drag this. And you can really just adjust it however you want that you think it looks right to fit on the ground behind him. So once I have that shadow where I want it, I can leave it there and maybe decrease the opacity a little bit since it is just a shadow on the ground. And then the last thing I do with shadows, just to make them look a little more realistic, is you can select the shadow and go to a blur filter. And I typically use the Gaussian blur. And I will make it usually between 3 and 4 on the radius here. And you can see that just like blurs the edges a little bit just to make it look a little more realistic on the graphic. You can do the same thing with the foot shadow here. Again, it just adds a little more realism to the shadow and makes it look slightly less photoshopped. So now that I have him and his shadows, I like to get in the habit of grouping things that I'm only gonna like move together and locking them once I have them where I want them. So for him and his shadows, that is where I'm gonna keep them for now. The next step that I'm gonna do is the background. And if you're wondering why I'm doing the background after I did the front and the cutout, I typically like to start with the part that's going to be the most important first and build around that so I position everything right. I don't usually work like background to front ground. So the first part of the background is going to be the grass that I'm included. Again, you want to make sure it's between the red background and him. And I'm just going to drag it to be about this height on him and leave it there. So to blend the grass in with the red background, the next step is going to be to add a gradient map. So to do that, I go down here to the Fill and Adjustment Layer tab, and I'll click on that and go to Gradient Map. So it automatically starts me out with a black and white one. And what I've done is I've already had a preset made to match with this, but since you probably don't have that one yet, you can instead click on this and select, you'll be able to select the red background. I can select one. Yeah, you'll be able to select the red background when you do this on your own. But I'm gonna put the custom preset I have right now. And I'm gonna wanna add a little more contrast to the grass. So I'm gonna drag the red closer to the white so that it gives it more contrast and makes parts of the grass pop out more. So once I have that, I'm going to make sure that my gradient map only stays on the grass photo. And I do that with a clipping mask, which means that the layer that I'm selecting to make a clipping mask is only going to be shown on the layer that's below it. So to do that, I'll right click on the gradient map and I'll just go to create clipping mask. And that attaches it to the grass photo so that those two stay together. Then to blend the grass into the top of the red, since you don't want such like a harsh horizon line, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the shadows and with the cutout and make a layer mask. And take the brush tool, again, keep it around 60% and just start erasing down to make sure the line from the grass to the sky is just more subtle and blends together better. And I would do this about down to his knee so that it just like has time to blend from being able to see 100% of it into even less of it. And then the last thing I do with everything on the background is I make sure it starts with a 50% opacity and I adjust it from there. So the grass, I'm gonna keep it 50% to start, and then I might increase it just a little bit to pop it out a little more. And again, this just like adds texture and really anchors him down into the graphic. So the next part of the background is going to be the photo. So I also included this in the library here. And I dragged it in the wrong place, sorry. I'm going to place it in the background and resize it to fill pretty much the entire top of the graphic. So once it's here, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the grass. And I'm going to create a gradient map of the same color. And I'm going to adjust the red again to make it appear a little more red, since that is our main background color. And I'm going to create another clipping mask. And then again, same thing. A lot of this is similar to what we did before with the layer mask, and taking the brush tool just to fade the edges into the rest of the graphic so it's not such a harsh line and the photo doesn't look like it was just placed there. So if I increase the opacity of the brush tool, it makes it a little easier to really eliminate the like sharp edges of the picture. And then again, I want to keep this at 50% to start, which actually looks pretty good to me. I'm going to keep this one at 50. And then we have our background complete. So again, since I finished this part of the graphic, I'm going to group all of these together and name them after the background, and I'm going to lock those layers. The next thing is super important to most sports graphics and is really what I think sets apart graphics designed for sports teams versus for like advertisements and anything else really, but it's the texture. So I've attached a few textures in the library I sent you, and I'm just going to drag them out onto the graphic. So as you can see right now, they're not fitting in right now. So I'm going to adjust the blend mode, which is this tab right here. There's a bunch of different options, and they will all change how this texture affects the graphic. But what I usually do for overlay textures is multiply, because it'll make the white disappear and just leave this as like a little corner, a little bit of dark in the corners. The next texture I'm going to add is this one that adds a little bit of grain, and same thing as what I did before. I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. So now you can see it's just a little more like edgy and has a little more dimension, which is super important to Clemson graphics at least, and most NFL teams I've seen use texture overlays on all of their graphics. So for these, I'll group them, name them after the textures, and lock them again. Those are super important to remember to lock, because anything you put on top of them, if you accidentally click slightly off, it's going to select the texture and change that. So one mistake I don't like to make is to forget to lock the textures and accidentally edit them instead of something else. So now that we have the textures on here, we can go ahead and start adding the final details, which are the text and the logos that I've attached here. I didn't want to have to send the whole font out and have everyone find where to download that, so I just converted all the text into smart objects, which means you can't type and change them. You just have them as I've sent them to you. So I'm going to start by dragging his name onto it and putting that up at the top here. And once I've placed it, I can use the align tools up here to make sure it's centered. And Then the player of the week, I'm also going to do the same thing with, make sure it's centered. And for this one, just to add a little bit of dimension, I did want to move it behind the cutout so that it really just ties it together and doesn't make him look like he's like popping out totally separate. And then I also have the logos of the Cardinals and the NFL that I'll place on the graphic. A lot of teams, including Clemson, want to include their logo in the bottom right corner. That's just kind of a rule for where to put your logo if it's not going to go somewhere else. So when it's being posted by the NFL, they will typically put like a little NFL logo in the bottom right corner. And then I have the NFC offensive title to go in the bottom left. The last thing that I attached is just a little finishing touch, which is these rectangles here that a lot of football teams include in graphics. It's usually to represent like the stripes on a helmet. But those are made just using their rectangle tool over here. I don't have it up right now, but yeah, I attached those so you can just drag them on here and have them be a part of the graphic. So now it looks almost identical to the one that I started with, except for a few tiny details. The last thing that we usually finish off graphics with, at Clemson at least, is with some like type of color overlay to really tie everything together. So the first thing we're going to do is, again, go down to the fill adjustment layer and go to color lookup. So these are basically filters for the entire graphic, and there's a long list of them here. But the one I'm going to choose to use is this Kodak one. And as you can see, it just affects the entire graphic. But we like to use it to just tie the whole thing together. And then these, like I always start the background at 50%, I always start these at 25%, just to make sure they aren't changing everything up too much and it still looks like you wanted it to originally. So I'm going to keep this opacity at 25%. But it's not a huge difference, but it does just tie everything together and make sure they all have the same filter over it, including the text. And then the last overlay that is used, at least on every Clemson graphic I've ever done, is the green. So this one, again, just fit on top of the whole graphic, and you can leave it there. And if you zoom in really close on the text, you can see it adds just a little bit of texture to it. Again, trying to add just a little more dimension and like edge to the graphic. So with it and without it. It doesn't look like it makes a huge difference, but it's just something to include just to finish up the whole graphic. So as you can see now, we do have two of the same one that I've showed you how to make today. And I hope you guys all learned something new and some new sports techniques that hopefully you can use in the future, maybe working with Clemson. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me, put them in the chat now. But I hope you all really enjoyed this, and thank you again for coming to my workshop.
Thank you.